The Synchromystic presents Synchromystique. The main reference is to the fabled 7 cities of gold, which were reputed sites of splendor and riches sought in the 16th century by Spanish conquistadors in North America. The captivating story has enduring appeal, as seen, for instance, in the 1955 film of the same name, featuring actors Robert Egan and Anthony Quinn, which latter star has figured in several other of our wide-ranging symbolic investigations. Rumored to be a realm so rich its streets were paved with silver and gold and its houses inlaid with precious jewels, the 7 cities had supposedly been founded by a bishop who chose exile in the perils of an unknown ocean rather than stick around while the sword of Islam, wielded by the all-conquering Moors, swept across his native Portugal in the 8th century. The story of Cibola, or Cibola, the 7 cities of gold, originated in 713 AD when the Moors were invading Spain and Portugal and the Iberian Peninsula was under Arab control. Portuguese bishops carried away gold and priceless religious artifacts from the city of Oporto and sailed away to a secret location that was only accessible by boat, but no one knew where this mysterious place could be. The Age of Exploration and the rediscovery of the Americas resuscitated the stories. A noteworthy mention of Cibola came from the 16th century Spanish explorer Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. After being shipwrecked off Florida in 1528, de Vaca wandered through what later became Texas and northern Mexico before his rescue in 1536. Several influential people were inspired by his accounts to go, or to send, parties in search of the fabulous city. As nearly as I can reconstruct events from my cursory survey of the record, the Viceroy of New Spain, present-day Mexico, Antonio de Mendoza, authorized an exploratory expedition in 1539. Franciscan friar and missionary explorer Marcos de Niza was appointed for this journey, along with a non-indigenous guide named Estevanico the Moor. Estevanico, sometimes called Esteban, was of African heritage and had been with de Vaca. De Niza's ethnicity and life are virtual question marks, but he may have traveled with Francisco Pizarro and Pedro de Alvarado. It's not clear that de Niza and company ever claimed they'd visited Cibola. In fact, the surviving report suggests they didn't. Instead, they approached a constellation of presumably Zuni pueblos and, being told that the city they saw was one of 7, they connected this, in their minds, to the legends of Cibola. For his part, Fray Marcos said he saw a magnificent, shining city on a hill off in the distance. The phrase has biblical origins, and, by the way, it will likely spark recognition in connoisseurs of U.S. presidential rhetoric. In 1961, John F. Kennedy, crediting Puritan John Winthrop, founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, referred to the country as just such a city. More recently, Ronald W. Reagan also conjured the specter of America as a shining city on a hill on the eve of his landslide 1980 victory over incumbent President James Earl Jimmy Carter. Though, according to journalist Mitch Horowitz, the great communicator, Reagan was inspired not by colonial Protestantism, but by a stream of 20th century Freemasonic philosophy articulated by Canadian-American mystic and prolific author Manly Palmer Hall. Hall's 1944 book, The Secret Destiny of America, sketches his case that occult fraternities have long awaited and prepared for the creation of what Sir Francis Bacon referred to as the New Atlantis. Roughly, Bacon's vision called for the creation of a utopia, ruled, if need be from the shadows, by those who had been suitably enlightened. Thus, Bacon inspired the Invisible College, training ground for the so-called perfected men, or, in contemporary lingo, the Illuminati. As a Wikipedia summary points out, the Shining City line has been repeated in a variety of contexts by Republican insiders such as Willard Mitt Romney and Raphael Edward Ted Cruz, as well as by intelligence apparatchik James Comey and Michael Pompeo, among many others. The phrase evidently still appeals to those who consider themselves a cut above the rest of us mere mortals, and/or to those who occupy key positions within the blob, or cryptocracy, or deep state, or establishment, or whatever term you prefer to apply to those who steer the herd, and to the principles that guide them. After all, in the words of seminal public relations propagandist Edward Bernays, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. Back in the 16th century, similar highfalutin talk prompted Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, acting on his own hook or on behalf of Viceroy Mendoza, to search for the golden cities. But instead of finding the fabulous locales, Coronado encountered only Indian settlements, including the Zuni Pueblos, even though he explored as far north as modern Kansas. Current thinking has it that it was these Pueblos which originally had inspired the legend. At some point around late 1540 or early 1541, Coronado's company met an Indian that they called El Turco, the Turk. He further inflamed, or renewed, the Spanish lust for a golden city, this time called Quivira. After months of fruitless wandering, Coronado realized that something was amiss. Explanations vary, but they all contain variations on the theme that El Turco was leading the Spaniards on a wild goose chase. According to a version of this story, the Turk actually confessed to such a plot. The idea was to exhaust Spanish resources or lead the conquistadors to their doom. Or both. At least, Coronado suspected as much. On these possibilities, it's worth noting a couple things. Firstly, various Catholic clergymen, including Bartolome de las Casas, are on record decrying the Spaniards' inhumane treatment of natives, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that Father Marcos might have shared the Turks' methods, even if for different reasons. Additionally, it's well known that European monarchs set their sights on the discovery of precious metals. Their lust for riches sometimes motivated them to deal with the devil. Take Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, also known as Charles I of Spain. Emperor Charles V had dealings with other major players in this story, including Antonio Mendoza and Coronado. Charles had funded Hernando de Soto's expedition to conquer Florida for wealth. Ostensibly Catholic, Charles V nevertheless, for a time, employed as an archivist the notorious archmagus Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa. Previously, we ranked Agrippa as one of our top 10 occultists of all time, and we discussed one of his important teachers, cryptographer and monk Johannes Trithemius, in 10 Secret Adepts. More pertinently, we also mentioned him in our video on occultist spies. Agrippa evidently served as a diplomatic spy under Charles V's predecessor, the esoterically friendly Maximilian I. For his part, and in fairness, Emperor Charles V does seem eventually to have picked up on Agrippa's heterodoxy, leading the latter to hastily depart the emperor's domain and hole up in France. But given that Agrippa was indisputably a major occultist and intriguer, his behind-the-scenes presence is remarkable. Recall that Agrippa's circle included important humanists and early Protestants. The confluence of espionage and Reformation-era politics raises questions about whether stories of golden cities were deliberately sown in Catholic circles as an early form of psychological warfare. Of course, it's said that later in the 16th century, Englishman Sir Walter Raleigh also tried to locate the related legendary El Dorado, though there are a couple of caveats. Firstly, evidently, El Dorado, which literally means the Gilded One, was originally applied to a mythical man, so rich that he was covered head to toe in gold dust every morning, only to wash it off every night, or at any rate during a special ritual. In many accounts, the Golden King was linked to Lake Guatavita, north of Bogota, in the South American country of Colombia. One could argue that El Dorado is a distinct legend. Still, it's undeniable that later explorers believed El Dorado was not a man, but a city or a country rich with gold. And over the next 2 centuries, the search for this newly defined El Dorado became the grandest of treasure hunts, inspiring forays into the Andes, the Amazon basin, and the North American deserts. Yet no trace of the Golden Land has ever been discovered. A second factor is probably more important. Recall that, following the lead of then Archbishop of Canterbury Matthew Parker and theologian Richard Hooker, Queen Elizabeth I definitively established England as Protestant. Between the Catholic monarchies in France and Spain, and the Vatican's so-called Counter-Reformation that gave birth to the initially militant Jesuit order, it has been argued that the English lived in mortal fear of a plot to overthrow their monarch. In response, Elizabeth and her advisors established a sprawling intelligence network under the headship of Sir Francis Walsingham that might have made famed 20th century Central Intelligence Agency chieftain Allen Dulles green with envy. Walsingham's death in 1590 evidently created a vacuum in which several of the remaining agents, including Anthony Bacon, Robert Cecil, John Dee, and Robert Devereux, vied for power. For an entertaining film set in this general period, see Roland Emmerich's Anonymous from 2011. According to some sources, Sir Walter Raleigh was right in the thick of things, implying that he was a slick operator. Therefore, there's no forced march between the story that Raleigh was searching for El Dorado and the conclusion that that's really what he was up to. For more on this complex geopolitical backdrop during the Age of Discovery, no less, see again our 10 occultist spies. And bear in mind that it was alleged Sir Walter Raleigh had been a member of Francis Bacon's secret society in England. For more on Raleigh's intrigues, stay tuned for our upcoming video on the Four Corners area of the United States. Complicating things further are the many points of intersection between the Catholic Church and various streams of the occult. We just mentioned Trithemius, on whom see our video 10 Secret Adepts, but history is replete with other examples, including the seminal 15th century Christian Kabbalist Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and the late 15th to early 16th century Cardinal and Neoplatonist Pietro Bembo. For more on these and many other characters, see our past videos. Further note that the notorious Rodrigo de Borgia, also known as Pope Alexander VI, lurks in the background. After all, it was he who legitimated King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella I's right to all lands discovered by Christopher Columbus by articulating his doctrine of discovery. The gist of his principle was that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited by Christian rulers, with tributes paid to the Vatican, of course. Interestingly, remember that Alexander VI had received Iberian Jews en masse into the Papal States following their 1492 expulsion by the same Ferdinand and Isabella. Among these immigrants were those Kabbalists who educated Pico, whom Alexander VI also shielded. We touched on Pico and his blending of Jewish mystical Kabbalah with Neoplatonic Christianity in several of our past presentations. Speaking of this whole episode, it's a little-known fact that Columbus, who some alleged may have been secretly Jewish, declared that a main motivation for his adventures was to secure wealth enough to finance the recapture of Jerusalem from the Muslims and to rebuild its temple. According to Columbus's contemporaries, including the aforementioned Dominican social reformer Bartolome de las Casas, Columbus was deeply religious, so much so that he may literally have become a lay monk by joining the Third Order Franciscans. 20th century British journalist George Donald McCormick alleged that these tertiaries of St. Francis periodically tested their powers of resisting temptation by sleeping next to naked women. For more on sex-tinged forms of religiosity, including a mention of how Indian nationalist and pacifist icon Mahatma Gandhi may have engaged in the same practice, that is, sleeping next to naked women, see 10 Sex Magic Cults. If you're scratching your head about how an ostensibly Catholic religious order could possibly intersect with eroticism or Judaism, remember that 16th century Spain was several hundred years downstream from the influential Ramon Lull. Though little known today, Lull was a 13th century Majorcan mystic who sought a way to establish a single faith and a single universal religious law based on overcoming the differences between the three great monotheist religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. We discussed Lowell's synchromystically curious island home in our past video, Mystery Mediterranean. But you could argue that today's Vatican-directed interfaith ecumenical movement is the fruit of this medieval Spanish esoteric. As it happens, Lull also was supposedly a tertiary of St. Francis. Small world. I'm sure the Vatican's numerous sex scandals are entirely unrelated to this history. Again, for general background on sex magic cults, don't forget to check out our dedicated video. By the way, historian Francis Yates calls Ramon Lull a precursor to the aforementioned Christian Kabbalah. On that whole wavelength, 20th century French Jewish historian Leon Poliakov cites celebrated 18th century French satirist and philosopher Voltaire to the effect that the Italian-born French queen, Catherine de' Medici, brought various Jews who were possessors of the secrets of the Kabbalah into France. You'll recall that Catherine's great-uncle, Giovanni de' Medici, contributed to the dissolution of the Western Church when, as Pope Leo X, he excommunicated Martin Luther in 1521. And the haughty Renaissance Kabbalistic humanist, Pico, was protected by Lorenzo de' Medici. But the specific stories of golden cities may have had their root in an earlier Portuguese legend about 7 cities founded on the mythical island of Antillia by a Catholic expedition in the 8th century, or one based on the capture of Merida, Spain by the Moors in 1150. According to Wikipedia, the fanciful Antillia Island first appeared on a portolan, or sailing navigational chart, which was dated 1424. This mention of Spain immediately harkens back to Lullism, which spun out of the Spanish island of Majorca, and the theme of a wealthy Christian city in the midst of hostile infidels summons the specter of Prester John. Prester John, of course, was a fabulous priest-king whom we may get into in a future video. Speaking of navigational portalans, one Louis Buff Perry once asserted that Christopher Columbus's first famous voyage had been undertaken in full expectation of finding America. You see, according to Perry and other researchers, Columbus had married into a Knights Templar family, and he thereby inherited various navigational charts and maps that had been created on the basis of pre-Columbian Knights Templar voyages to the New World. Exploring these angles would drive us headlong into discussions of artifacts like the Kensington Runestone and other miscellanea, much of which was discussed by Harvard University Associated Professor Howard Barry Fell in his controversial 1976 book, America, B.C. Rest assured that these synchromystic musings will be continued, for example, in our upcoming Four Corners video. Still, as a brief coda, let's gesture here towards economic theory, believe it or not. For it is interesting to consider that the widespread fascination with hidden cities of vast wealth, like Cibola, stemmed partially from the then prevailing view that a kingdom's financial health boiled down to a question of how much gold was in the monarch's coffers. During the Age of Discovery or Exploration, which was roughly the late 15th to the early 17th centuries, the funding for expeditions to the New World predictably came from European kings and queens. It was therefore natural, on the one hand, that these rulers would desire to get their investments back. And indeed, we might have predicted that any sales pitch, so to speak, on the part of a would-be adventurer like Christopher Columbus would seek to play upon aristocratic ambitions, both for global domination and for untold riches. And the prospect of finding golden cities certainly would help in that regard. When modern commerce got going in the age of mercantilism from approximately the 16th to 18th centuries, the bottom line didn't change all that much. Literally, mercantilism was economic nationalism, and it sought to increase the prosperity and power of a nation through restrictive trade practices. Specifically, mercantilism was an economic theory that said that a nation should increase its wealth by selling more than it buys from other nations. The goal? to increase the state's gold and silver with exports rather than to deplete its gold and silver stores through imports. If advantageous trade is good, then surely finding a pile of lootable riches in the hands of backwards natives would be even better. Just ask Air Force Central Intelligence Agency insider and PsyOps mastermind Edward Lansdale. In any event, by the 18th century, French physiocrats such as Pierre-Samuel Dupin and François Quinet, forerunners of classical economics, argued that land is the source of all wealth, especially via agricultural production. With this innovation, we would soon be off and running with brand new ambitions into an age of imperialism. Of course, the theoretical picture would evolve further into a more robust set of ideas about what, in Adam Smith's analysis, constituted the wealth of nations. This is not to deny for 1 second that stories of lost or buried treasures don't have perennial appeal. Hordes of code breakers and travelers have tried to unravel the Beale ciphers or unearth the lost Dutchman's mine, the latter supposedly hidden away in the aptly named Superstition Mountains, a name that's as on the nose as Montana's Scapegoat Wilderness, where in 1996 a once promising mathematics savant named Theodore Ted Kaczynski was arrested for being the so-called Unabomber. Seldom mentioned is the extensive secret brainwashing Kaczynski suffered at the hands of a Harvard psychologist named Henry Murray. We mentioned these shady MK Ultra-esque goings-on in this sort of tale in Occultist Spies. The legends of Cibola may even have motivated ill-fated British geographer Percy Harrison Fawcett, who disappeared in Brazil's Amazon basin in 1925 trying to find a lost city. Regardless, the fact is, world empire building was predicated on searches like those for Cibola and El Dorado. The earliest realistic prospects for bona fide control of the entire globe, after all, go back to the Renaissance-era European monarchies. Whether some global aspirations were also hardwired into the United States from its inception in the late 18th century is an obvious and pressing follow-up question with importance for today. Therefore, we hope to tackle this and other related issues in upcoming videos, including a planned survey of the many oddities related to the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. For starters, though, look for our very next installment on the Four Corners, which is already in production.